Once upon a time, in the serene village of Wonderland, nestled in the heart of eastern Nigeria, there lived a wise and generous king named Anthony, known far and wide for his compassion and exemplary leadership. King Anthony ruled his people with love and fairness. Yet, behind the walls of the grand palace, his heart carried a deep sorrow, the loss of his beloved wife in a tragic car accident years ago. Since that day, his only source of joy had been his son, Prince Ken, the heir to the throne. Prince Ken, however, was far from the man his father hoped he would become. Handsome, tall, with a chiseled jawline and a boyish charm, he had inherited his mother's looks but lacked her grace and discipline. Instead, he lived a life of indulgence abroad, moving from one party to another, and jumping from one lady to the next. To Ken, the idea of ruling a village, no matter how beautiful, felt like a cage compared to the dazzling life he enjoyed in the States. King Anthony, growing older and weaker, longed to see his son return home. He wanted Ken to learn about the customs and traditions of their people, and prepare to take over the throne. Yet every time he called, Ken had the same response. "Dad, there's no life in the village. I don't want the throne. Find someone else to do it." But the king couldn't give up. One evening, he called Ken again, his voice tinged with desperation. "My son, I am your only surviving family. The chiefs are questioning my ability to lead, because I have no assurance that you will take my place. Please come home." Ken sighed loudly over the phone. "Dad, I told you, I'm not interested in the throne. I can't leave my life here for that." Frustrated and heartbroken, the king decided to take drastic measures. He concocted a plan, a lie, but one born out of love. He called Ken late one night, his voice frail and trembling. "Ken, I'm dying. The doctors say I don't have much time. If you don't come home soon, you'll find a corpse waiting for you." The news hit Ken like a punch to the gut. "Dad, no! Please, stay strong. I'll book the next flight home. Nothing will happen to you." The following evening, Ken arrived at the palace. His annoyance at being forced back home faded the moment he saw his father standing at the gates, arms wide open. "You're not dying?" Ken asked, confused and slightly irritated. The king chuckled. "Welcome home, my son. I had to do what I could to bring you back." Ken sighed but couldn't stay mad. He hugged his father tightly, realizing how much he had missed him, even if he wouldn't admit it. That night, the palace was alive with celebration. The royal chef prepared all of Ken's favorite dishes: peppered goat meat, jollof rice, and fried plantains. As they sat at the dining table, the king tried to engage Ken in conversations about the kingdom, but Ken's mind was elsewhere. By the next day, the prince was already missing his fast-paced life. The next morning, Prince Ken wandered through the palace gardens, the chirping of birds and the gentle rustling of the leaves, doing little to soothe his restlessness. His father's insistence on grooming him for the throne felt like a burden he wasn't ready to carry. By afternoon, he couldn't bear the stillness anymore. "Dad, can I borrow one of the cars?" he asked, entering his father's study. The king raised a brow but nodded. "Just be careful, and don't go too far." Ken didn't wait for further instructions. Grabbing the keys to a sleek black SUV, he drove off, relishing the wind against his face and the temporary escape from palace life. He didn't know where he was going, but the smooth village roads felt oddly comforting. As he rounded a bend, his car screeched to a halt, narrowly avoiding two pedestrians, a young boy and a lady. Ken jumped out, furious. "Are you blind? Do you know how expensive this car is?" The boy cowered, bowing repeatedly. "I'm sorry, my prince. We didn't see you coming." But the lady was unshaken. Dropping her basket, she stepped forward, her piercing gaze meeting Ken's. "And do you know how expensive life is? You almost killed us. Maybe if you weren't speeding like a lunatic." "Excuse me?" Ken interrupted, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Auntie Sonia, stop," the boy whispered, tugging at her arm. "That's the prince." "And so?" she shot back, her voice steady. "Royalty doesn't give him the right to drive recklessly." Ken was stunned. No one had ever spoken to him like that before, especially not a lady. "You're insane," he muttered, climbing back into his car and speeding off, her voice still ringing in his ears. That evening, Ken returned to the palace in a sour mood. After a long shower to wash off the day's frustrations, he headed straight to bed, ignoring the worried glances from the staff. He didn't want to think about the fiery lady he'd encountered earlier, but her defiance lingered in his mind, an uninvited memory that refused to fade. Prince Ken's first few days back in the village were nothing short of monotonous. The palace, once filled with the vibrant energy of his childhood, now felt like a cage, each moment more suffocating than the last. The prince had no interest in the traditions, the history, or the responsibilities that came with being the future king. To him, the village and its people were an outdated relic, the only thing that kept him from losing his mind was the thought of his life in the States, where he was free to indulge in whatever he pleased. That morning, after a long night of restless sleep, Ken was jolted awake by a sharp knock on his door. His head throbbed from the alcohol he had consumed the night before, his body aching from the late-night revelries. "Your Highness," a timid voice called from the other side of the door. "Breakfast is ready." It was the maid, one of the few servants who had managed to stay on his good side. But even her presence did little to alleviate his bad mood. He groggily rubbed his eyes, the remnants of sleep clouding his mind, before throwing the blanket off and swinging his legs to the floor. "Why are you waking me up?" Ken snapped, his voice laced with irritation. "Can't anyone let me sleep in peace around here?" The maid stood in the doorway, clearly startled by the prince's outburst. "I'm sorry, Your Highness," she stammered, her head bowed in respect. "The food is ready. The king would like you to join us." Ken let out an exasperated sigh, rubbing his forehead. He couldn't understand why his father was so insistent on him being involved in the day-to-day activities of the kingdom. "I'm not hungry," he muttered, his tone sharp. The maid hesitated, glancing up at him. "Your Highness, I'm only doing my job," I said. "I'm not hungry," Ken interrupted, standing up abruptly, his frustration boiling over. The maid quickly retreated, her face pale. As she left, he could hear her quiet footsteps fading down the hallway. But his mind was already elsewhere. He wasn't in the mood for palace food today. The thought of a lavish meal in this lifeless place made him sick. Instead, he threw on some clothes and left the palace grounds, hoping to find some distraction outside. Later that afternoon, Ken found himself at one of the local restaurants. The atmosphere was lively, filled with people from the village and nearby towns, all enjoying a moment of respite. But to Ken, it was just another stop in a long list of places where he felt out of place. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on a woman sitting alone at a corner table. She was striking tall, with curves in all the right places, her hair styled in a sleek ponytail. Her confidence was undeniable, her smile bright as she glanced around the room. Ken's gaze lingered on her a moment too long, and before he knew it, his feet carried him across the room. He slid into the seat opposite her without invitation. "Are you here alone?" he asked, his voice smooth, though a bit too forward. The woman didn't seem taken aback. Instead, she raised an eyebrow and smirked. "What's it to you?" Ken leaned back in his seat unfazed. "I just thought I might keep you company." She chuckled, her lips curling into a knowing smile. "I'm not the company you're looking for, if that's what you mean." Ken wasn't deterred. He had no shortage of charm, and his reputation as a ladies' man preceded him. He leaned in slightly. "You'd be surprised," he said with a grin. "I'm exactly what you need." The woman studied him for a moment, before her gaze softened. "I get paid for fun, Prince," she said, her tone lowering. "Not for your sweet talk. If you want me, you'll pay me what I'm worth." Ken was taken aback for a second, but then his signature smirk returned. "That's exactly what I had in mind." Without a second thought, he stood up and offered her his hand. "Let's go then." They left the restaurant together, and within the hour, Ken found himself back at the palace, his new companion in tow. It was a routine that had long since lost its excitement for him. Meet someone, take them home, and be done with it. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was the endless monotony, or the fact that his life had become so predictable. Either way, it didn't matter. As night fell, Ken lay in his bed, the events of the evening still fresh in his mind. His guest had long since left, and he was alone again in his room, staring at the ceiling. He heard the sounds of the palace outside, distant echoes of laughter and conversation. but it only reminded him of how disconnected he felt from everything. The king had summoned him to dinner earlier that evening, his usual request for Ken to spend time with him. Ken didn't care. His father had been insistent on him learning the ways of the throne, but Ken had no interest. What did it matter? His life was in the States, not here. But still, the king continued to make his requests. It was exhausting, and it made Ken resent him more. He could feel the weight of his father's expectations hanging over him, and the more he pushed them away, the more they seemed to return, stronger and more suffocating. Ken lay back, closing his eyes. Maybe tomorrow will be different. The sun rose over the lush village, bathing the king's palace in golden light. The chirping of birds and rustling of leaves filled the air. But inside the royal chambers, a somber atmosphere loomed. King Anthony, a man once full of vigor, sat on his grand chair with a heavy heart. His son, Prince Ken, had returned home, but his behavior was far from what the king had hoped for. The morning after the prince had stormed out of the dining area, the king called a trusted advisor into his chambers. "My son is destroying himself," the king said, his voice laced with worry. "He must learn discipline, but I fear I have failed him as a father." The advisor, Chief Augustine, leaned forward. "Your Majesty, Prince Ken is still young. Perhaps this is his way of rebelling against the weight of the throne." The king shook his head. "I cannot allow him to continue this path. If I fall ill, who will guide him? Who will guide this kingdom? I must find a way to make him stay and embrace his responsibilities." Later that day, King Anthony experienced a sharp pain in his chest that left him breathless. His vision blurred momentarily, and a cold sweat covered his brow. Alarmed, he called for the palace physician, who arrived within minutes. "Your Majesty, your blood pressure is dangerously high," the doctor said gravely after taking his vitals. "You need immediate rest and must avoid all stress. If this persists, it could lead to a stroke or worse." The king sighed deeply. "But my son, Ken's recklessness is adding to my burdens. How can I rest when he's like this?" The doctor hesitated. "Your Majesty, perhaps your illness is an opportunity. If Prince Ken sees the gravity of your condition, he may finally take his responsibilities seriously." The king nodded slowly, understanding the truth in the doctor's words. That evening, Ken, who had spent the day drinking and wasting time, was summoned to his father's chambers. The sight of his father lying weakly on the bed shook him. "Father, what's wrong?" Ken asked, his voice faltering. I am not well, my son," King Anthony replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "The doctor says I need rest, but all I truly need is you by my side. If you continue to distance yourself from me and the kingdom, I may not survive much longer." Ken's heart skipped a beat. For the first time in years, he saw the fragility in his father's eyes. "Father, don't talk like that. You'll be fine. I'll stay as long as you need me to." The king nodded weakly. Days turned into weeks, and Ken's recklessness continued despite his father's state. His nights were filled with loud parties, and he often returned home drunk, much to the displeasure of the palace staff. The tension in the air was palpable. One evening, the king's health took a sudden turn for the worse. The palace physician was called immediately, but he recommended a specialist from the town's biggest hospital, because he was not in the country. The next morning, a doctor arrived, accompanied by a young nurse. Her name was Sonia, a bold and principled woman with a sharp tongue and a keen sense of duty. She had no patience for nonsense, especially from arrogant individuals. The doctor performed a thorough checkup on the king and concluded that his high blood pressure needed constant monitoring. He turned to Sonia. "You will stay here to oversee His Majesty's care," the doctor instructed. "Ensure he takes his medication and gets proper rest." Sonia frowned. "But sir, I wasn't prepared for this. I left my phone and personal belongings at the hospital. I can't stay here indefinitely." The doctor sighed. "You'll manage for tonight. I'll bring you things tomorrow. The king's health is more important." Reluctantly, Sonia agreed. She was shown to a guest room near the king's chambers and immediately set to work organizing his medication. That evening, Prince Ken stumbled into the palace reeking of alcohol. He barged into his father's room, oblivious to the presence of Sonia. "Dad, I need money," Ken slurred, his words barely coherent. "One of my girls is outside, and she needs cash." Sonia, who had been arranging the king's medicine, turned sharply. "Aren't you ashamed of yourself? she snapped. Ken froze. That voice was familiar. He turned to see the nurse glaring at him, her arms folded across her chest. You again? Ken exclaimed. What are you doing here? Sonia raised an eyebrow. You two know each other? The king asked weakly. Neither of them answered. She's my nurse, the king continued, his voice firm despite his condition. She's here to ensure I get better. Ken scoffed. This woman? She's trouble, Dad. Are you sure she's qualified? Sonia rolled her eyes. If you don't have anything meaningful to say, you can leave. Your father needs rest. Ken, though stunned by her audacity, turned on his heels and stormed out of the room. The next morning, Sonia's day began with attending to the king and ensuring he followed the doctor's instructions. Meanwhile, Ken's mood grew darker. His hangover was worsened by the maid informing him his breakfast was ready, a meal that had gone cold by the time he made it to the dining table. Why didn't you tell me earlier? He barked at the maid, his hand raised as if to strike her. Before he could follow through, Sonia's voice cut through the tension. You will do no such thing, she said firmly. You're an adult. Act like one. Ken turned, his face red with anger. Who do you think you are to speak to me that way? Sonia stepped closer, her eyes blazing. I'm someone who won't stand by and watch you bully people for doing their jobs. Grow up, Prince Ken. The room fell silent as Ken stormed out, his frustration mounting. For the first time in years, someone had dared to challenge him, and it wasn't a feeling he enjoyed. By the end of the day, Ken found himself thinking about Sonia more than he cared to admit. Her sharp words and unwavering confidence intrigued him, though he would never admit it out loud. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of their story. The palace had become a blend of silence and tension, since the king's health took a turn for the worse. His condition was stable but fragile, and Sonia's presence had become a critical part of the daily routine. The staff admired her dedication and firmness, though some whispered about her growing clashes with the spoiled prince. Prince Ken, on the other hand, had not changed much. He continued his late-night escapades, showing little regard for his father's condition or the kingdom's affairs. But beneath his carefree facade, something about Sonia gnawed at him. Her boldness, her refusal to cower before him, it was unlike anything he had ever experienced. One humid evening, Ken returned to the palace in a drunken state. His steps were unsteady, and his laughter echoed through the quiet halls. In his arms was another woman, a stunning but overly made-up lady, who seemed out of place in the royal residence. Where's my room? Ken slurred to a passing guard, ignoring the disapproving stares of the staff. Sonia was on her way to check on the king when she spotted the commotion. She paused, taking in the sight of Ken and his guest. Shaking her head in disbelief, she approached him. Are you serious? Sonia asked, her tone sharp. Bringing a stranger into the palace at this hour while your father is ill? Ken turned, squinting at her. Oh, it's you again, Miss Morals. Shouldn't you be fussing over my father instead of judging me? Sonia folded her arms. Your father's health is my concern, yes, but so is the dignity of this palace. And right now, you're making a fool of yourself. Ken's companion smirked, amused by Sonia's fiery response. Who's she? Your babysitter? The woman teased. She's nobody. Ken snapped, though his voice lacked conviction. Sonia refused to back down. If you have no respect for yourself, at least have some for your father. This behavior is disgraceful. Ken glared at her, his temper rising. Stay out of my business, he shouted before storming off, dragging his companion with him. Sonia sighed and continued to the king's room, muttering under her breath about entitled men and their reckless ways. The next morning, Sonia decided to address the king about Ken's behavior. She found him sitting on the edge of his bed, looking weary but alert. Your Majesty, she began, I need to speak with you about the prince. King Anthony sighed deeply. What has he done now? Sonia hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. He brought a woman into the palace last night. He's reckless and inconsiderate. I know it's not my place, but I'm concerned about the impact it's having on your health. The king's face hardened. Ken has always been difficult. I hoped bringing him back here would change him, but it seems I was wrong. Sonia softened. Maybe he just needs someone to guide him. Someone who won't tolerate his nonsense. The king looked at her thoughtfully. You're a strong woman, Sonia. I've seen the way you stand up to him. Perhaps you're exactly what he needs. Sonia blinked, caught off guard. Your Majesty, I'm just here to do my job." The king smiled faintly. Sometimes fate has a way of putting the right people in the right places. Don't underestimate your influence. Later that day, Sonia decided to take a walk around the palace gardens to clear her mind. The vibrant flowers and the soothing sound of the fountain provided a welcome escape from the tension inside. She didn't expect to run into Ken, who was sitting on a bench, his head in his hands. He looked different, less arrogant, more human. Sonia debated whether to walk away or approach him. Against her better judgment, she chose the latter. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Ken looked up, surprised. "What do you care?" "I don't," she said bluntly, "but you look like you could use someone to talk to." Ken hesitated before shrugging. "It's nothing. Just life." Sonia sat down a safe distance from him. "Life's hard for everyone, but running from your responsibilities doesn't make it any easier." He chuckled bitterly. "Is that another lecture?" "Call it advice," she replied. "You can do better, Ken. I've seen glimpses of it." Ken looked at her, his defenses lowering for the first time. "Why do you care so much?" Sonia met his gaze. "Because I care about your father, and whether you like it or not, you're part of his happiness." For a moment, they sat in silence, the tension between them shifting into something unspoken. That night, Ken lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Sonia's words echoed in his mind, stirring something he hadn't felt in years: guilt and a desire to change. Meanwhile, Sonia prayed silently in her room, hoping her words had planted a seed in the prince's heart. Unbeknownst to both of them, their paths were becoming more entwined, leading to a journey neither of them could have anticipated. The palace had become a shadow of itself. King Anthony's illness weighed heavily on the household, and Prince Ken's reckless behavior continued to aggravate the situation. Despite Sonia's efforts to maintain peace, the young prince remained a thorn in her side. One night, the palace was unusually quiet. The guards whispered among themselves. The staff tiptoed in the hallways, and Sonia was in the king's room ensuring he took his evening medication. The moment was interrupted by loud yelling from Ken's quarters. "Who do you think you are, barging into my life like this?" Ken's voice thundered. Sonia rushed out to find a scene unfolding that was all too familiar by now. A young woman, dressed provocatively, stood in Ken's doorway, arms crossed defiantly. She looked furious. "I gave you what you wanted, and now you're refusing to pay me," she spat, her voice shrill. Ken looked disheveled and embarrassed. "I don't have cash right now. Leave me alone." Sonia stepped forward, her patience wearing thin. "What's going on here?" The woman turned to Sonia, her eyes blazing. "This prince of yours owes me 50,000 naira. He brought me here, had his way with me, and now he's refusing to pay." Sonia looked at Ken, disgust evident in her expression. "Is this true?" Ken stammered, unable to meet her gaze. I didn't know she'd demand money." "Unbelievable," Sonia muttered. She took out her phone, transferred the money to the woman, and turned to Ken. "This is the last time I'm cleaning up your mess." The woman checked her phone, nodded in satisfaction, and stormed out. Sonia faced Ken, her anger barely contained. "You're a disgrace, Ken. Your father is sick, and this is how you behave? When will you grow up?" Ken didn't respond. He simply turned and shut the door behind him. The next morning, Ken was unusually quiet. He stayed in his room, replaying Sonia's words in his head. Her frustration cut deeper than he expected. For the first time, he felt ashamed. Later that day, he found himself in his father's room. King Anthony looked frail but managed a smile when he saw his son. "How are you feeling, Dad?" Ken asked, his tone softer than usual. "I'm managing, my son," the king replied, "but I'm more worried about you." Ken frowned. "Why me? You've lost your way," the king said, his voice weak but firm. "This kingdom needs a leader, someone who can protect and guide its people. You've been blessed with privilege, Ken, but you squander it. I don't have much time left. I need to know you'll be ready to take my place." Ken looked down, guilt washing over him. "I don't know if I'm ready for that, Dad." "You don't have to be perfect," the king said, placing a hand on his son's. "You just have to try." That evening, Ken wandered into the palace gardens, seeking solace. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, their fragrance calming his restless mind. He didn't expect to see Sonia there, sitting on a bench with her notebook. He hesitated, then approached. "Mind if I join you?" Sonia glanced up, surprised. "As long as you don't ruin the peace." Ken chuckled nervously and sat down. "I just wanted to say, thank you." "For what?" "For last night," he admitted, "and for everything you've done for my dad." Sonia looked at him skeptically. "What's this? An actual moment of gratitude from the great Prince Ken?" He laughed, scratching the back of his head. "I know I've been a jerk, but I'm trying. It's just hard." Sonia softened, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes. "Change isn't easy, Ken, but it's worth it. Your father believes in you. Maybe it's time you start believing in yourself." Ken nodded, her words sinking in. For the first time, he felt a spark of hope. Over the next few days, Ken began spending more time at home. He sat with his father, listened to his stories, and even asked about the kingdom's history. The palace staff noticed the change, and Sonia found herself cautiously optimistic. One evening, as Sonia prepared the king's medication, Ken walked into the room. "Can I help?" he asked. She raised an eyebrow. "You? Help? I'm serious," he said. "Teach me what to do." Sonia handed him the medication and guided him through the process. He was clumsy at first, but she saw his determination. "You're not as hopeless as I thought," she teased. "Don't get used to it," he replied with a grin. But Sonia couldn't help smiling. The change in Prince Ken's demeanor did not go unnoticed. The once arrogant and irresponsible prince was now humble, polite, and more attentive to his father and the palace staff. King Anthony, though still weak, felt a glimmer of hope for his son's future. One morning, as King Anthony sat on his throne, enjoying the cool breeze, Ken walked in and greeted him with a deep bow. The gesture took the king by surprise. "My son, you've been acting differently lately," the king said, studying Ken's face. Ken nodded. "I realize how much I've hurt you, Dad. I want to make things right." The king smiled, tears welling in his eyes. "You've made me proud, Ken. Now I can rest knowing the kingdom will be in good hands when the time comes." Ken knelt before his father, holding his hand. "I promise to be the son and leader you've always wanted me to be." Later that afternoon, Sonia prepared to leave the palace. Her job was done, and though she had grown fond of the king, she was ready to return to her normal life. King Anthony called for her and handed her an envelope filled with money. "Thank you for everything, Sonia. You've done more than I could have ever asked." Sonia knelt to thank the king, her heart heavy. She had grown attached to the royal family, despite the challenges. As she was about to leave, Ken walked into the room, his face falling when he saw her luggage. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice tinged with panic. Sonia looked at him calmly. "My job here is done. It's time for me to go." Ken's heart sank. "But we still need you here." "My dad needs you. The king is getting better, and he has you now," Sonia replied. Ken stepped closer, desperation in his eyes. "Sonia, please stay. Not just for my dad. Stay for me." Sonia froze, her heart skipping a beat. "Ken, I know I've been terrible," he said, his voice breaking. "But you've changed me. You've made me want to be a better person. I can't imagine this palace without you." Sonia sighed, tears threatening to spill. "Ken, you don't need me to be a better man. You've already started that journey on your own. And besides," her tone is soft but firm, "my new posting is in Lagos. I have to report there tomorrow. But I can't stay. I have a life outside these walls." Ken looked defeated but nodded. "At least let me walk you out." At the village motor park, Ken stood beside Sonia as she purchased her ticket. The noise of traders and passengers filled the air, but Ken only focused on her. "I'll miss you," he said, his voice barely audible above the commotion. Sonia looked at him, her heart heavy. "I'll miss you too, Ken. Take care of your father and yourself." The bus conductor shouted for passengers to board, and Sonia turned to leave. Ken watched as she climbed into the vehicle, his chest tightening. As the bus drove away, Sonia waved from the window. Ken stood there, watching until the vehicle disappeared from sight, a sense of loss mingling with newfound determination. Months later, Ken found himself in Lagos for a business meeting. Though he was busy, his thoughts kept drifting to Sonia. He couldn't resist the urge to find her. After some inquiries, he located the hospital where she worked. When he walked into the building, Sonia was at the reception desk, talking to a colleague. "Sonia," he called softly. She turned, her eyes widening in surprise. "Ken, what are you doing here?" "I came to see you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I haven't stopped thinking about you." Sonia smiled, her heart racing. "Ken, you didn't have to come all this way." "I did," he replied, "because I need you to know that I've changed, and I want you in my life not just as a friend, but as someone I care deeply about." Sonia stared at him, her emotions conflicted, but as she looked into his eyes, she saw the sincerity and growth. "Ken, if you're serious, you'll have to prove it," she said, her tone teasing. He grinned, challenge accepted. Over time, Ken and Sonia grew closer, their love blossoming into something beautiful. They returned to the palace together, where King Anthony blessed their union. Ken became a wise and compassionate leader, proving that people can change when given the right reasons. With Sonia by his side, he ruled the kingdom with strength and kindness, making his father proud and leaving a legacy that would be remembered for generations. The lessons highlight the importance of responsibility, humility, and respect in building strong relationships and personal growth. Reckless actions affect not just the individual, but also those around them. Courage to do what is right can inspire others to change. Conflict resolution demands wisdom, strategy, and leadership. Personal growth is a continuous journey that requires self-awareness, patience, and accountability. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe to my channel.